They were born on the same day. They were copies of each other and simultaneously wholly different people. One was a sadistic schizophrenic, the other a striving businessman. One was a promiscuous homosexual, and the other tried to be a family man. But was there really that large of a difference between them, or was it all fiction? The KRAY Twins were true gangsters who were on the top and lost everything because of their own stupid decisions. They had only themselves to blame for having a bad ending. Here is their genuine story. If you look for why the KRAY brothers became what they were, you should look at the fact that their family was of Irish and gypsy ancestry, a truly explosive mix. Ronald and Reginald were born on October 24, 1933. Reggie, technically, was the older brother because he was born 10 minutes earlier. The twins were not the only children in the family. They already had a 6-year-old brother, Charles, who would later play no small part in the brother's life of crime, and a sister, Violet, who unfortunately died in infancy. Everyone took part in raising Ronnie and Reggie except their father. Their dad was in the precious metal scrap business, selling clothes and appliances, and was constantly on the road. Even when the father was in London, where the family lived, he was more often seen drinking in pubs than at home with his family. Their maternal grandfather, Jimmy Cannonball Lee, partly replaced the father's role. It was the grandfather, who was once quite good at boxing, who got the twins addicted to the sport. Subsequently, boxing skills would become very useful for the two brothers. Interestingly enough, their grandpa was a class act. He liked to do tricks like putting his tongue on a red-hot poker, balancing on bottlenecks, and tap dancing in pubs. Their grandfather had taught them to box when they were teenagers, and they were predicted to have a bright, athletic future. But their natural talent was hindered by disgusting discipline. They had some success, however. The brothers even reached the finals of the London School Boxing Championships. Subsequently, Ronnie and Reggie fought 6 professional fights each, with Ron winning 4 and Reggie not losing a single one. As boxers, they were very different from each other. Reggie was cold-blooded, cautious, very technical, and, most importantly, always listened to advice. Ronnie was the opposite of him. He just went right for the kill until he was stopped. The difference in the boxing styles was a good demonstration of the difference in temperament. Reggie was serious and analytical, while Ronnie was impulsive and risky. Boxing was supposed to instill the necessary discipline in the brothers, but ended up being an instrument intimidation. The further the KRAYs grew, the harder it became to control them. Their military service, if you can call it a service, was probably the starting point for their later life as criminals. It was in the army that the brothers showed who they were as adults. The twins were drafted into the Royal Infantry in 1952. After arriving at the regiment and looking around, they realized that they didn't like it there. So the brothers decided not to stick around and headed calmly for the exit. A corporal who saw them leaving tried to stop them, but the corporal didn't expect what happened next. Ronnie punched him in the lower jaw. After this, the KRAY brothers quietly returned to their East End home. It's hard to say what they were hoping would happen, but it was clear that the army would not let this kind of trickery go. So the next morning, the police came to them and tried to arrest them. Of course, the KRAY brothers resisted, but they were captured and turned over to the army the following day. They were first locked up in the Tower of London and then transferred to Somerset's Shepton Mallet Military Prison for a month to await trial. They were found guilty and sent to prison in Canterbury, Kent. Perhaps the brothers were already thinking about pursuing a criminal future. Perhaps it was their youth and intemperance. But their so-called military service put an end to their future in boxing and many other possible careers. All these actions looked childish and completely absurd. In prison, the KRAY brothers had no intention of stopping. Outbursts of rage, dousing guards with excrement, setting mattresses on fire. Once, they even managed to pour a huge vat of boiling water on a guard and handcuffed another guard to the cell with his own handcuffs. And this is only a small part of their adventures in prison. They were then transferred to a regular cell block, where they attacked their guards with a vase and made their escape. However, they were quickly returned to prison and awaited transfer to the civil authorities for crimes they had managed to commit on the outside. It was madness. In the end, everyone, including the guards, feared them, and, as we can see, for a good reason. So it's not surprising that their last night in that prison was just that. They spent their last night in Canterbury drinking cider, eating crisps, and smoking cigarillos, courtesy of the young national servicemen acting as their guards. Perhaps there was little doubt as to what the KRAY brothers would end up doing. Given their behavior, temperament, and unruly disposition, a life of crime awaited them. Soon after their release, that's what they did. Borrowing money from their older brother Charlie, the KRAYs bought a rundown billiard club where they began their criminal enterprise. Most of the customers were lower-end criminals, and the KRAY brothers didn't go into business for themselves immediately. By the late 1950s, the KRAYs had been working for J. Murray, an authority figure from Liverpool, for several years. They were involved in carjackings, armed robberies, and arson, and with the proceeds, they acquired other clubs and properties. That's when the brothers decided to create their own gang, which they called the Firm. There was a division of responsibilities between the brothers. Reggie was in charge of strategic development, and Ronnie was in charge of combat operations. Reggie made use of his boxing abilities in the criminal world, and he apparently developed a tried and tested method of breaking someone's jaw with a single punch. He would offer his target a cigarette, and Reggie would strike it as it neared their mouth. Their open, relaxed jaw would take the brunt of the impact, supposedly breaking every time. Ronnie, aka the Colonel, in charge of combat operations, increasingly used force without good reason. Gradually, Ronnie's behavior began to alarm his gangster buddies, but it was nothing compared to what he would do next. In the fall of 1956, Ronnie the Colonel shot his opponent in the leg during a conflict. He filed a police report against Ronnie, and Ronnie faced time in prison. But the case was soon dropped. Ronnie remained free. However, this did not pacify him. On the contrary, he became more and more troublesome. He drank heavily, abused drugs, and became morbidly suspicious. Whereas his brother Reggie tried to keep his head down and keep his criminal record low, Ron did so loudly and without a care. He seemed to get off on violence. In 1960, Ronnie KRAY was imprisoned for 18 months for threats and extortion. There, his mental condition began to deteriorate dramatically, and he was sent to a psychiatric clinic for examination, where he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. Subsequently, Ronnie's violent temper would become one of the reasons for the collapse of the KRAY's gangster empire. But to create an empire and become the kings of London, it was necessary to deal with their competitors, the Richardson Gang. Based in South London, the Richardsons were notorious for their sadistic torture, pulling teeth out with pliers, severing fingers with bolt cutters, nailing victims to the floor with 6-inch nails, burning them with cigarettes, and passing electric charges through their genitals. With the rapidly evolving KRAY Brothers gang, the Richardson Gang was sidelined. They were not particularly against it, but skirmishes between the gangs occasionally rose. The main confrontation between the two gangs happened on March 9, 1966. The day before, there was a shootout in a nightclub between the Richardson Gang and Richard Hart, a KRAY Brothers supporter. Hart was killed in the shootout. This incident led to the arrest of almost the entire Richardson Gang. George Cornell, also a Richardson Gang member, was not present at the club at the time of the shooting and therefore was not arrested. Since he was at large, Cornell decided to visit his friends at the hospital, who were injured in the shooting. Afterward, George Cornell went to a pub just a mile from where the KRAY Brothers lived. At this time, Ronnie was drinking at another pub. Cornell had badly offended Ronnie a year earlier by calling him a fat homo. When Ronnie found out about Cornell's whereabouts, he went there with his chauffeur and assistant to get even for the murder of his friend Richard Hart, and, of course, to get even for the fat homo comment at the same time. It seems that the second option was the main reason. Ronnie walked into the pub with his assistant and walked right up to Cornell. When he saw Ronnie, he uttered, "Well, look who's here." That was the last thing he said. A shot went off. The bullet went straight through Cornell's head. Shocked by what he saw, Ronnie's assistant fired 5 shots into the air and told customers not to report the incident to the police. All the visitors were frightened and knew who Ronnie KRAY was very well, so they didn't say anything to the police. However, some did talk, but that was much later. The murder of George Cornell won't happen until 6 years later and will put an end to the rivalry between the Richardson gang and the KRAY brothers, but it will also be one of the reasons why the twins' empire collapses. 6 years ago. In the meantime, all was well. While Ronnie KRAY was finishing his time in prison, his brother Reggie was actively engaged in his criminal business, trying to cover it up with legitimate businesses. As head of a real estate operation, Peter Rockman sold Reggie a nightclub called Esmeralda's Barn to ward off threats of further extortion. The location is where the Berkeley Hotel now stands. Ownership of Esmeralda's Barn increased the KRAY's influence in the West End by making them celebrities as well as criminals. The twins adopted a norm in which anyone who failed to show due respect would be severely punished. They were aided in their dealings by a very bright banker named Alan Cooper, who wanted protection from the rival Richardson gang. In the 1960s, Reggie and Ronnie were considered prosperous and charming owners of many colorful establishments, including nightclubs. Much of their fame had nothing to do with criminal activity. The brothers socialized with lords, deputies, and people from the world of show business. They tried to link the best of both worlds in their clubs, gangsters and celebrities, and they were pretty good at it. Ronnie would later write in his autobiography, "They were the best years of our lives. They called them the swinging 60s. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were rulers of pop music. Carnaby Street ruled the fashion world, and my brother and I ruled London. We were effing untouchable." In the personal life of the brothers, things were going pretty well too. Frances Shay met Reggie KRAY when she was only 16. He was 10 years older. Their wedding took place in 1965 and caught everyone's attention. Only Frances' mother was not pleased by the union of her daughter and one of the KRAYs at all. Ostentatiously showed her contempt for the KRAY brothers by wearing black attire to the wedding. She knew how this could have ended, but Frances didn't want to listen to her mother. And, as it turned out, she should have taken the advice. Frances was vivacious and seductive, not the skinny, shabby girl everyone saw on screen and legend. She was a real wild child, and yet her marriage to this charming but still criminal man was doomed. The newlyweds spent their honeymoon in Athens, and 8 months later, Frances returned home to her mother and declared her desire to leave Reggie. Family life was tumultuous, and just a week after the wedding, Frances made her first suicide attempt. Serious mental illness and several more suicide attempts would drive her to electroshock therapy. At one point, she even planned to shoot herself with a pistol that was hidden under her bed. A knife, a meat cleaver, and a sword could all be found in their bedroom. At some point, Reggie started putting a gun by the bed and keeping a switchblade knife under his. He often told Frances to shut up and threatened her physically. Yet there's a fair amount of writing in Frances' diaries describing Reggie as an extremely positive person. Ronnie lived close by and frequently visited them, and he was fond of walking around in nothing but his underpants. In addition, Frances suspected that Reggie was gay. But out of the two, the one who was genuinely gay was Ronnie, though he didn't like to be called that. Ronnie personally selected the waiters and waitstaff at the club, the main criterion being physical appearance. Naturally, it was nice, good-looking guys, not girls. He called himself bisexual, and incidentally, he was not ashamed of it. Especially since it was true that Ronnie loved not only men, but women as well. In the 60s, Ronnie dated a woman he wanted to marry for 3 years, but it didn't work out. Much later, Ronnie did get married, 2 times. He identified with the 19th century English general Charles George Gordon. Gordon was like me, homosexual, and he met his death like a man. I hope I do the same when it's time for me to go. There were even rumors that the brothers had sex with each other as teenagers so that no one would find out about their orientation. It was also a red flag for the police because homosexuality was illegal in England in the 1960s. Francis, who was now part of the KRAY family, was forced to live with them, but it didn't last long. Reggie and Francis' marriage ended after only 2 years. The official version of the investigation remains that Francis Shea committed suicide. However, there's another interesting but rather dubious version. In 2002, a former cellmate and supposed lover of Reggie KRAY stated that it was Ronnie who killed Francis. He was jealous for his brother and made Francis swallow pills. This was revealed to a cellmate by Reggie KRAY himself. Before committing suicide, Francis left a note saying that she wanted her maiden name, Shea, stamped on her tombstone. She no longer wanted to be associated with the KRAY family. Reggie was against it and made every effort to have her buried under his last name, the KRAY family name. The brothers' popularity peaked in 1965 when they were interviewed on national television. Everyone in Britain knew that the KRAY brothers were playing with fire. Everyone knew they were the kings of London's criminal underworld, but at the same time, they were admired, imitated, and everyone wanted to be friends with them. The street gangs carefully copied the brothers' style, trying to look like them. But as it turned out, the end of the whole empire was near. 1966. The first grave mistake was the murder of previously mentioned George Cornell in a bar. Ronnie, who was getting tougher every year, killed him in plain sight. Even though the witnesses remained silent for a while, as it turned out, they did not remain silent forever. The second grave mistake, for which both brothers would later be convicted, was the murder of Frank Mitchell. Frank Mitchell has been called Britain's most violent prisoner. In the 1950s, he became friends with Ronnie KRAY, who was also serving time in prison. It's unclear why Mitchell liked KRAY, but Ronnie soon offered to break him out of prison. Perhaps such help for Frank should have positively affected his reputation and strengthened the KRAY brothers' position in the underworld. Reggie, who was on the outside, took his brother's offer very reluctantly. He knew how troubled Mitchell could be. Still, after a while, he agreed to help with the escape. As it would turn out later, he did it for nothing. On December 12, 1966, Mitchell went out into the swamps to work with a group of prisoners. Mitchell asks the only guard to allow him to step away to feed some wild ponies. After being permitted to, he walks to a country road where a car is already waiting for him. Inside the car were the KRAY brothers' accomplices. As soon as Mitchell got in the car, they drove to London. This was one of the most effortless escapes from prison in history. Frank Mitchell was hidden in a prearranged apartment. Hundreds of police officers and even Royal Air Force helicopters searched for him. Through his men, he tried to negotiate with the government to commute his sentence, but all attempts were in vain. The twins soon felt the full brunt of Mitchell's wild temper. Mitchell's tremendous physical strength and temper were difficult to control and restrain. He did not want to surrender to the authorities and return to prison, but he was no longer willing to sit in an apartment he was not allowed to leave. The brothers, on the other hand, were afraid to let him out on the street or return him to prison because it might become known that they had helped him to escape. They even moved a girl in with him that he was in love with, but all of this only made the situation worse. The KRAY brothers had made a serious mistake agreeing to help Mitchell escape, but the job was done. Now they had to decide what to do with him next. On December 24, 1966, a KRAY brothers gang member named Donahue asked Mitchell to get in a van to move to a quieter place outside the city limits where he was to meet Ronnie KRAY. Mitchell was unhappy that he was leaving without his beloved, but Donahue convinced him that it would be safer for her to arrive a little later and separate from them. Several men were already seated in the van, 2 of whom were armed with revolvers. As the van doors closed and the driver started the engine, the perpetrators opened fire. Donahue counted 12 shots fired before Mitchell died. His body was then strapped with metal mesh and dumped into the English Channel. Reggie KRAY later recalled Mitchell's jailbreak as one of his biggest mistakes. But that was not all. Soon another fatal mistake would finally bury the KRAY brothers' empire. October 1967. Although Reggie KRAY and Frances Shay's marriage was unhappy, it seems the gangster did love her. It had been 4 months since his wife's death, but Reggie was still in pain. He couldn't keep doing business as usual, and the famous conflict with Jack McVitie, aka the Hat, happened shortly after. He needed to kill Leslie Payne, the very man who helped the brothers immensely in their business. McVitie was paid £500 in advance, but McVitie could not kill the financial advisor. He also didn't want to return the money to the brothers. Without thinking twice, the brothers decided to take the Hat, McVitie, out. Under the pretext of a party going on, McVitie was lured into a basement apartment. Upon entering, he saw Ronnie KRAY sitting in the living room. As he approached McVitie, Ronnie unleashed a barrage of verbal abuse in his direction and ended up cutting him below his eye with a piece of broken glass. An argument broke out between the twins and McVitie. The situation became quickly heated, and Reggie KRAY, holding a gun to McVitie's head, pulled the trigger twice. 2 misfires ensued. Afterward, one of the gang members grabbed McVitie and Reggie grabbed a knife. He stabbed McVitie in the face and stomach and plunged the blade into his neck. Reggie didn't stop, twisting the knife even as McVitie's body lay breathless on the floor. Reggie committed the public murder of a man whom many members of the firm considered undeserving of death. It later became clear that one of the reasons for McVitie's brutal execution was his reputation as a drug addict and a heavy drinker, which could have hurt the business and the brothers themselves. But the deed was done, and many gang members began to look at the brothers with mistrust. After all, any of them could be in McVitie's position next. Detective Chief Superintendent Leonard Nipper Reed of Scotland Yard was promoted to the murder squad, and his first assignment was to bring down the KRAY Twins. The detective had been investigating the brothers since 1964, but never found any solid evidence or witnesses willing to testify against the KRAYs. Reed was a serious detective. Out of 15 murder cases, he failed to solve only 1. In the case of Ronnie and Reggie, he was just waiting for the brothers to make a mistake somewhere, and soon that moment came. By 1967, the detective had amassed enough evidence. There was nothing surprising about this. The brothers had become insane and were no longer cautious at all. 2 public murderers alone are worth mentioning. The Scotland Yard Conference decided to arrest the KRAYs on the evidence already collected, in the hope that other witnesses would be forthcoming once the KRAYs were in custody. At dawn on the 8th of May 1968, the police team led by Scotland Yard Inspector Leonard Nipper Reed simultaneously arrested the twins and 24 other members of the firm. Reed secretly negotiated with each of the defendants and offered members of the firm one last chance to testify against the KRAY brothers. But no one in the group was going to give up their bosses. The brothers hadn't made any good decisions in a long time, so they pushed their gang members to admit to crimes instead of them. The brothers offered 3 inmates from the gang to take on 3 murders. It was an absurd move, because who would want to confess to a murder they didn't commit and be stuck in prison for a long time because of it? Ultimately, the gang members decided to negotiate with Detective Reed. It was much better than taking on the murders. The gangsters gave away a lot of information, but it wasn't enough for the police. They needed a man who had seen the worst crimes of the KRAY brothers with his own eyes, and preferably also not be part of the gang. One of the worst crimes, the murder of George Cornell in a bar, was seen by a waitress. She was silent when everyone else was silent, but she spoke up when she learned that the KRAY brothers were in jail and that there was a possibility of putting them there for a long time. The police gave her complete anonymity, and she testified that Ronnie KRAY shot Cornell. That was the end of it. In March 1969, both brothers were sentenced to life in prison for 30 years without parole. In announcing the guilty verdict, Judge Melford Stevenson uttered, "In my view, society has earned a rest from your activities." It was the longest murder trial in British criminal justice history. Their brother Charlie was also imprisoned for 10 years for complicity. Many still consider this the greatest injustice to the older brother, since no evidence was presented of Charlie's presence at the crime scene. Charlie received jail time for bearing the last name KRAY. It was later revealed that the gang members had plans to execute the brothers shortly before their arrest. They were tired of watching the KRAYs make one mistake after another. The brothers could no longer run the business carefully and adequately, and very soon they would disappear forever. Prison, in a way, saved the KRAY twins because they didn't have a life anymore on the outside. Ronnie KRAY was a Category A prisoner, denied almost all liberties, and was not allowed to be with other prisoners. He was eventually labeled insane, and his paranoid schizophrenia was tempered with constant medication. In 1979, he was committed and lived the remainder of his life in the Broadmoor Hospital in Crawthorne, Berkshire. Reggie KRAY, constantly being refused parole, was locked up in the Maidstone prison for 8 years. In 1997, he was transferred to the Wayland prison in Norfolk. The twins wasted no time trying to make money, even in prison. In 1985, hospital staff discovered Ronnie KRAY's business card, which prompted an investigation. It revealed that the twins, incarcerated in separate institutions, were running a lucrative business, providing bodyguards for Hollywood stars. The twins, their older brother Charlie, who was already out of prison, and other members of the gang who were not in prison were involved in running the business. The business was clean, so officials were quick to drop the case. One of KRAY Enterprises' most famous clients was Frank Sinatra, who took advantage of the service by hiring 18 bodyguards during his 1985 visit to Wimbledon. Ronald KRAY never got out. He died on March 17, 1995, at age 61, after serving 27 years. Reginald, on the other hand, was released in 2000, just 8 weeks before his death. He died on October 1st at age 66 after spending 32 years in prison. Reggie's funeral became one of the main events in the East End of London. His casket was carried in a horse-drawn hearse, followed by a lavish procession. During the funeral, crowds of thousands lined up to applaud. As much as one might want to romanticize the outlaws, the brothers were loved. This was especially true of Reggie. Given what Ronnie was like, it's unlikely the brothers could have run their business and been free for long. They had everything: influence, power, money, official friends, and celebrity friends. But a series of ill-considered foolish actions quickly enough ruined their entire empire. Of course, things could have turned out much better. But this is how it ended up going.